Well, hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 8th, 2017. And this month, the topic in our Best Practices Forum is motivation. And one of the things that I had people take a look at is this book by Dan Pink called Drive. And it's an interesting book. And for any of you, I'm assuming that those of you, and Patty, I think you're online here with me, so maybe you can tell me if this is something that can be seen, but let me see if I go here and I open this other window. Patty, can you see my website?
I can.
Okay, good. So
yes.
Hopefully it'll also be on the video for those of you. So for those of you who are like, well, you know, I'd love to read that book one of these days, but I don't have time, just so you know, all the Best Practices Forum are kind of listed here under the Leadership tab in my website. And right here, they all are. Now, I may at some point not have them listed here, but you can always get to every single one by going to Best Practices Forum. So this is the Motivation Models page. So this is the class we're doing today. And after today, I'll have a copy of this particular recording on there, but I'm also going to have this one, which is The Puzzle of Motivation by Dan Pink. This is his TED Talk on it. He's a great speaker. He's fun. I'd play it for you right now, but you can't do TED Talks for some reason the audio won't come through when I'm doing it that way. So, but that's who we're talking about, Dan Pink. So if you can read the book, great read. If you don't have time to read the book, he's got TED Talks, and that's not the only one. So if you go on YouTube and you just put Dan Pink Motivation, he's got tons of videos because, first of all, he's just really interesting, and he's got web TV and all of that. So he's going to be talking a lot. So if you don't have time to read, you'll certainly have enough time to listen to a couple of his videos and get an essence of what he's talking about when it comes from motivation. But what I'm also going to do right now is give you the short version. And the short version is he tells the story about these experiments that people do. And Dan Pink is an economist by training. But what he is really specializing in now is behavioral economy. So there are a lot of people, there's this whole field of behavioral economics. And there's all these interesting things that it's kind of like a combination of psychologists, sociologists, and economics really puzzling over human behavior. And so one of the reasons that Dan Pink is he presents this case for it being so incredibly surprising, this information that he's uncovered on motivation, is because despite the fact that it's been uncovered for years, businesses still don't pay any attention to it. And the applications in business are vast. So let me give you the nutshell overview. So he talks about research, and one of the things that he talks about is what we'll call the candle problem. And maybe I'll be able to bring up a picture of the candle problem because, let's see, let's go to Google here. There's so many images, but I'm going to go into Google Images, and I'm going to say Dan Pink candle problem, and we'll get a little illustration here. Perfect. So, all right, so here's the candle problem. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Nope. Darn it. Nope, I got to just show you the picture. I should have put it in the speaking thing. So I'm just going to put it right here, the candle problem. So it's probably small on your screen, but what you can see is there's a table, there's a candle, there's a box of tacks, and there's a match book. And the problem is that you bring your students in, your research subjects in, and you tell them that their task is to affix the candle to the wall and light it so that it doesn't drip wax on the table. And essentially what happens is they do, in this particular experiment that tells him a lot about motivation, they do two things. The first group of students, they say, we're timing you. And actually, they tell both groups of students that we're timing you. And we're timing you, but the first group of students, they say, and we're using the times just to get a measurement of how long it takes people in general to solve this problem. So that's group A. We're just trying to get a measurement of how long it takes to solve this problem. And then group B, they say the same thing, we're timing you, but then they say, if you are in the top 20%, you're going to get $5. And if you are the top performer, you're going to get $50 or something like that. And so essentially they give an incentive to people to go faster in the second group. And ultimately what they find is that the second group that were given the incentives to perform faster actually goes slower. And there's two ways to do the candle problem, to present the candle problem. One is like this. The second way is like this. Whoops, now you see the solution. So essentially, when the tacks are in the box, you don't see the box for its potential to be tacked into the wall and hold the candle so it doesn't drip wax. So he goes through this all in the TED Talk that's on my site. So I'm not going to go into more detail here because he tells the story in such a better way than I'm telling it. But essentially the idea is that when this is a tough problem to figure out, the people who are incentivized to figure it out more slowly than the ones who are not incentivized to figure it out. And when it's an easy problem to solve, so apparently when you take the tacks out of the box, it becomes an easier problem because now the box, it's easier to see the box as a holder for the candle. So this is the solution. And then when this is presented, the people that are given the incentives are actually faster. So what does that mean? So I'm going to get rid of that. What that means is that people are not motivated by incentives when they have to do something that requires them to be creative in their problem solving. And they tend to be motivated by incentives when they don't really have to think, they just have to do. So essentially, incentives, rewards and punishments, carrots and sticks, bonuses in companies are given for like higher sales and higher performance, but when they're given in the cases where people have to be really creative to perform better, often they end up defeating themselves, and there is less and less performance the more high stakes the bonuses are. So you get a reverse effect. So I'm going to stop right there and open it up for your questions or thoughts on that. So anyone, Patty, Nikki, what did I say that surprised you, or what are you curious about?
This is Patty. I think I am surprised. I would not have guessed that. So that's the first thing. It makes me want to read the book. But it surprises me, but yet it doesn't. It surprises me at first, and I looked at the pictures, and I think you're right. I think if you have the text in the box, then you don't think of the box as the vessel. So you're not thinking as creatively. But I think this idea of incentives for creativity is really, really important, and I think it's something that needs to be. Obviously, he's delving into it, but how interesting is that? That I think that kind of goes against everything that we've thought to be true, that incentives work in every situation, and he's telling us that maybe they don't. So that's surprising to me.
Yeah, and it's surprising for business. It's also interesting for our own motivation. And, I wish that I could play the TED Talk for you because he does it so much better than I do it. But let me tell you some more stories. So one story is that they decided to replicate this. And so they went to MIT and these other schools, and they gave them all sorts of tasks to do. And some of them were physical tasks like shooting baskets. Some of them were really hard tasks like memorizing numbers or doing puzzles, and they just did a wide variety of tasks. And there were all these behavioral economic, I can't say that word. I'm on a recording here. See, now here the pressure is to say it better. Behavioral.
There you go.
Economists. There we go. Behavioral economists.
Okay.
Economists.
Okay.
That's where the thing is. So all these economists were very interested in this. This study was sponsored by the U.S. Treasury because we're trying to figure out what motivates people, and why this is so important for economy is that people tend to assume that people behave and make decisions rationally, and we don't. And gosh, there's more that I'm reading now that's going to show up in our April Best Practices Forum, because I'm reading now a lot about cognitive thinking patterns and biases, which is also a branch of behavioral economics, which is just incredibly interesting. So just that's your little teaser for April. But they had all these people study. So they gave these students that they were studying different levels of rewards for how well they performed. So you'd get maybe a couple bucks just to show up for the experiment if you didn't perform well. If you performed moderately well, maybe you'd get $5. And then if you performed in the top whatever percent, you'd get $20. So you'd get more money. And then essentially what they found out is for the tasks that required absolutely no thinking, no complex thinking. So you just had to focus hard and do it, like maybe running, or I don't remember the exact examples, but, you know, listing numbers as fast as you could, but just things that required complete focus, narrow focus. So just do. There's the finish line, just do. Those actually worked fine with incentives. So in a company that might translate to making telemarketing calls with a script. You know, you've got the script right in front of you. You don't have to do anything. You just keep dialing for dollars, right? So I think there are many tasks that you can incentivize that way, and the incentives actually work. But what they found is any task that required any kind of complexity, the people who were incentivized the most fell on their heads. And this is amazing. So the ones who were incentivized, you know, lowest or medium, they actually did better than the ones that were incentivized and higher. And then they took it to somewhere where the money that they had to offer these people to participate in the experiment actually meant a lot more. So they went to India, a place in India where what they were offering as the top incentive was worth the equivalent of 2 months' pay. So now I'm going to make tons of money if I just perform. And the same thing happened, even worse. So in anything like a puzzle that you're trying to do really, really fast that requires you to think in different ways other than how you're used to thinking, the racing through it actually backfires the higher the incentive. And so many, many more stories and examples, and that's why you have to listen to his videos, but many, many stories and examples of where he describes all the different experiments they did. And if I can, when I put this final video together, I'll see if I can insert one of his videos. I don't know if I can or not, but I'll try. But essentially, all the tasks that require complex thinking don't get done well with incentives. So then he gave other examples of when they did do well. And it turned out that, for example, in a software company, when they gave everybody a day to work on whatever they wanted, and the only caveat, and they could work with whoever they wanted, and the only caveat was that they would present their findings at the end of the day at kind of a fun party, they got tons of really great work done. And then he gave the Wikipedia example about how this doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, where Microsoft tried to put together this encyclopedia that would just have all this information. They paid tons of engineers to do it, and then Wikipedia actually was the product that became the product. and everybody works on Wikipedia by volunteer, and the product is given away for free. And then he talks about Linux operating system. So there's all this stuff that genius workers do, and they're already getting paid, but they're doing this in their spare time for the fun of it. So why do people do this stuff for the fun of it? Well, what he found out is that there are three main drivers that really drive creative work. And he said most of us in our work are creative. So he said the three drivers are autonomy, self-direction, so that's autonomy, like I get to decide, I get to make my own decisions about what I'm going to do. Mastery, which is this drive to do something really, really, really well. And purpose, that it's making a contribution. So that those are the three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So basically he called these motivation 1, 2, and 3. So at motivation 1, you're just surviving. You need to make sure that you have air to breathe and, food to eat and the basic things. At motivation 2, when you just have to do something, you can actually, be like B.F. Skinner. You can be the empty box and just do, and you can actually respond to rewards and punishments. But for anything that requires creativity, out-of-the-box thinking, any kind of complexity, the kinds of what motivates people comes from the inside, and it's the drive for autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So I want to hear your thoughts on this so far, like anything that's coming together in your head. Nikki, do you have anything that is coming up for you as you're listening to this?
I'm just trying to apply it to, being an entrepreneur, because I think it's such a mix of creativity, but also very, because you have to create structure at the same time. And so I'm trying to think, because I was thinking back on my tag project, or even in relation to acting, and how, when I put a lot of pressure on myself, which is essentially what incentives do, because even though it's something great, you put pressure on yourself to achieve that thing. So I wonder if it's actually the incentive, or if it's the stress that you put on yourself from getting incentives or the lack of getting incentives.
I think that's actually, let me say this, and then don't forget what you're going to say, but I think that's actually a brilliant point, and I actually could concur with you on that it may be the pressure, because I've observed in myself, and I shared this with the group this morning, that I've noticed in myself that in situations where I put pressure on myself to perform, I crumble. And when I'm not putting pressure on myself to perform, I tend to perform, kind of like the baby crawling. Your curiosity leads you. So when I don't put pressure on myself to perform, I tend to do really well. When I put a certain kind of negative pressure on myself, I crumble. And so that's why it's not surprising to me. And so now I want to hear more of what you were just saying.
Well, to kind of continue on to what you're saying there, it was like, when I was doing tag and I thought that I had to make money with it, it really disconnected me from the project, and I felt like I was stunted, like I couldn't move forward because I thought I was going to be wrong. I thought I was, and those are the things that happen when you put pressure on yourself, if you don't want to make mistakes because you think you'll be wasting time or whatever it is. But what I've noticed is if I can turn my goal or what my intention is into something that is a little bit like it doesn't matter. So like for acting, when I say I'm not tied to the outcome, I'm just enjoying the process. It's kind of along the same lines as putting incentives or not putting incentives. And like if you can reframe the way that you want to achieve your goals or accomplish these certain missions, that and that's the difference between having an incentive or not. It's the way that you're framing your mindset about what needs to get done and what's important or not, which creates stress or doesn't create as much stress.
Wow, this is really powerful because I started thinking about it in the class today, but what you just said just hit me like a ton of bricks about one concept that we talk about at Aspire all the time, which is detaching from the outcome. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about how when people are having a hard time achieving something, it's often because they're overly attached to the outcome. And so this is a psychological insight that was not touched on in his book, but we touch on it at Aspire all the time. And let me show you the needs model here. So this is and Nikki, I don't know if you're online or not. You probably aren't, but you probably know Maslow's hierarchy, right?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we better talk about it then. So what you're visualizing here is a pyramid. Patty, you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, right?
Yes.
Oh, Maslow's hierarchy. I thought you said Maxwell. I don't know. I thought you were saying someone else's name. Yes, I know Maslow.
Okay, good. All right. So, yeah, I probably didn't say it very clearly. So Maslow's hierarchy is a pyramid, and so his theory of motivation, there's 5 levels to the pyramid. And I'm going to talk about this for a couple of minutes and then connect it to what I was just saying about being overly attached to the outcome. If I forget to make that connection, somebody please interrupt me and make me do that, okay? So there are 5 levels to Maslow's hierarchy. It looks like a pyramid. And the theory is that these are the things that motivate human beings, and the stuff on the bottom levels of the pyramid take precedence over the stuff on the top. So at the bottom is your physiological and biological needs. So what you want to think about is being in physical homeostasis, is having all those needs met. But if you're thirsty or you're hungry or you're in a smoky room and you can't breathe or you're feeling sick, so you got a virus attack in your body, you're out of homeostasis. So now you have unmet physiological needs, and your body is driven to get well, to get air, to get food, to get that glucose in your system, or, to get the glucose out of your system, right, to get the insulin up. Your body's constantly, the temperature, running a fever, you're too hot, too cold. All those things are your physiological needs. And the ones that are related to survival, like I'm not going to be able to live for very long if I can't breathe, if I can't get air. So that's the one I like to use a lot because I think it makes it everyone can imagine what it would be like to not get air and how it would hardly matter how much your salary was if you couldn't get air. I mean, if you were in a situation where you're having trouble breathing would absolutely take precedence. So the next level up from that is what we call safety or shelter. And that is basically having a roof over your head, someplace where you feel relatively safe, where you can sleep at night, so you can actually get your sleep and, not worry that someone's going to come and kill you. And in our society, we don't have a lot of wars here in the United States. At least we haven't yet in our lifetime. So, if you're in a country that's sort of war torn, then that's going to come up a lot. When the bombs are going off, or, when you're worried that someone's going to come and bust in your room, or even if you're in the inner city here and there's a lot of gang violence and, you could get killed in a drive-by shooting randomly any night and you're well aware of that, then that's going to play in a lot. But most of the way it takes place for most of us in the United States is this idea of money and having enough money to cover our house and our basic bills. So when we start worrying that we're not going to bring in enough money to do that, most of us tend to panic, and it feels very different from if you're at least meeting your bills. So you get into this financial cycle where you just feel really ucky and miserable. And so that's kind of how the safety needs get expressed here. Love and belonging is the next level up, and that's basically relationships. And pretty much what people need are, a few people that they feel like they could go to. It's the idea of feeling you're not alone, that you're cared for, somebody's around that's got your back. If you get really upset or really vulnerable, you just need someone to lean on, you've got a few people you could call. Could be your family, could be a handful of friends, Most people don't need more close relationships than that, but they do need to feel like they belong, that they have some close friends. Then on top of that is self-esteem. Darn it, need to fix that.
Yeah, I noticed that.
You noticed it, but I did. The funny thing is I actually already corrected it somewhere. And then it looks like an M here. Does it look like an M there?
Yeah, it is. It looks like an N on the other one, but it's an M here. Yeah.
Oh, aha! I corrected it on one slide. I knew I had corrected that. Wait, this is the one. This is one that's fraught with mistakes. Now, see, this is good. This will challenge my what do we call it? My self-esteem needs. So, if I need to be thought of as smart, and anyone's listening to this video and they're hearing all my inability to pronounce the word economy and my inability to spell the word esteem, then I'm going to have to be really confident and have my self-esteem need met to not be upset about that and to be willing to still post the video, which I'm going to do. So this is, and the reason I said that's actually relevant because of what I'm going to say next. So self-esteem is basically feeling okay about who you are in the community so that people don't think you're stupid or that you're not valuable or that you're, being well respected in the community. So I not only want to be in the community, in the tribe, but I also want to feel valued in the tribe. Now, the way it feels to have all of these needs met is basically a sense of okayness. So I'm okay. So as long as I'm not sick, I'm feeling okay. I'm not really thinking about, protecting my sick needs. I mean, I might have some prevention. I might have, I can make sure that I'm not going to ever be thirsty if I always have water around. And maybe sometimes I'll be thirsty, but I have easy access to it. So I can set up systems to make sure that most of my needs are met. At the love and belonging level, I can consciously develop good relationships with people. At the safety level, I can make a conscious financial plan to make sure I can cover my bills. At the self-esteem level, I can work on my personal growth and my confidence so that I'm feeling okay about myself regardless of what other people's opinions of me. But what's interesting is that in any given day, you're going to have some unmet needs. And when you're having those unmet needs, you're going to have an emotional reaction. It's going to feel like a stress reaction, and it could feel like anger, or it could feel like fear, or it could feel like anxiety, or loneliness, or hurt, or anything. But it basically doesn't feel good, right? So it's either physical pain or it's psychological pain, but it's absolutely uncomfortable and painful. And so you are completely driven to fix whatever caused this need to stop being met. And so I like to sometimes use a sailboat metaphor where this is a big sail and your unmet needs are your little holes in the sail, and you're constantly putting energy into patching up all your holes. So we tend to be very preoccupied in patching up all our holes. But when all of our holes are patched up, then what we do is we move to this level, which is self-actualization, where we're motivated by our values. And when I'm talking about values here, I'm essentially talking about what you value. So what would you spend your time on if you had extra time? What would you spend your money on if you had extra money? That's what you would value. So if you value your family, you might organize a trip with your family. Or if you value art, you might paint, or you might go to a symphony, or you might, do something else. But the kinds of things that you might do when you don't have to worry about getting your needs met, you might decide you want to make a contribution to the world. So some people divide this into several levels, but essentially this is where purpose sits. So if you combine Dan Pink's model with sort of the Aspire version of Maslow, so if you map both Aspire's thinking to Maslow's hierarchy and Dan Pink's thinking, you'll see that his purpose is right up here in self-actualization, and I would contend that his autonomy and mastery are in the self-esteem realm. And the biological needs will fit down here at the bottom of the pyramid, and the carrots and sticks, I'm assuming would be in safety, but I really don't know. That's why I have a question mark here. I don't know if that necessarily maps or where it maps. But the most important thing to keep in mind, and why we talked about this attaching to the outcome, is that normally when I talk to people about goals that they have and getting their goals met, the ones who get stuck a lot of times are really stressed out about what will happen if I don't meet this goal. What will happen if I'm starting this company and it fails? What happens if this relationship doesn't work out and I lose this relationship? What happens if I'm not able to ever lose weight? What happens if, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So they get these goals, but then they're not doing really well at achieving the goals, and they're not feeling really confident about their ability to get to the goals, but it really, really matters that they achieve the goal. Well, sometimes that sets up what we call a cycle of self-sabotage. And what I call it at Aspire usually is you have to detach from the outcome, because if you're too attached to an outcome, essentially what you're doing is you're using whatever the situation is to meet an unmet need. In other words, if I'm overly attached to a person, usually let's say I got a crush on a guy and he has absolutely no interest in me, but I just can't get over my obsession with him. It has nothing to do with real love. It has to do with I somehow hooked my unmet need onto this guy, and I'm overly attached to him. So the energy that he's feeling from me is very manipulative, and so he's going to run the other way. So anytime that you have an unmet need, and what you want to imagine is kind of holes in your sail, right? So anytime that you have an unmet need, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have some kind of an emotional reaction that's uncomfortable. And, your emotional reaction is going to be kind of based on how you tend to respond to a threat. So some people are fights, so they feel more anger and self-righteousness. Some people go into flight, so they feel more anxiety and worry. Some people go into freeze, so they just procrastinate forever, but they're still feeling completely terrified. So it's usually fear or anger or stress or milder forms of those emotions like stress or frustration or something. But anytime a need becomes unmet, you're feeling one of those emotional reactions. What other people around you feel is some kind of energy that is not something that they enjoy. It's not interesting, it's not engaging, it's not attractive. Boy, I cannot stop getting the external noise out of this. So now you're experiencing Nahi trying to turn off a noise that she can't turn off. There we go. Okay. So you're going to find this noise, this noisy energy emanating from people who have an unmet need. And essentially, it doesn't feel good. And so what you want to do is run the other way. And so another example, so the classic example, of course, is, the love stinks thing. So we get a crush on somebody who we want to feel loved, and we have an unmet need for love, and so we get a crush on somebody who just can't ever love us, and so we just keep trying to get them to love us more and more, and the more we try to get them to love us, the more they run the other way. So that's why they say, well, either you're the one that's running away or you're the one that's running to, but you have to get your need for love met before you can actually develop a healthy, loving relationship. And so we are all responsible for getting our own needs met. And we do need other people, to experience love with other people, but we can take responsibility for developing a lot of really strong, loving relationships, which makes us less susceptible to any one person dumping us, and it's a lot easier for us to allow that person to dump us because we know in our hearts that there are many other people out there who would love us. So that's the confidence that comes from having your needs met and doing the work of getting your needs met. But when you notice that you are overly attached to an outcome of something, typically what has happened is you've accidentally gotten into a dynamic with it where it means something for you to get that met, and you've got a need attached to the outcome. So I think it's really interesting, Nikki, that you bring that up, because I'm thinking that when they gave incentives to people, what maybe interfered with these experiments is that the incentives put pressure on people, right? I have to perform because I'm going to be really embarrassed if I'm not a top performer, or I have to perform because of whatever. But it poked right into some of their needs, their innate needs, as I'm wondering. So that's why I think it's interesting. So I'm going to open it up for your thoughts now. Patty, you're on mute. Nikki, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I actually think that's probably exactly right. Like, I think it wasn't necessarily the incentive, but it is what the incentives created. And just like all the examples with dating and stuff of wanting it too much, because that's what happens when you give someone an incentive. It makes them think that they need that when they didn't really need it to begin with, because they didn't have to do that project or that game. But once you say, here, like, you're doing it for this reason, and then it created this whole scenario in their brain that then changed the way that they looked at it, which I think affected it. So I don't know. I think that that's a really useful realization that can help us all with the way that we handle life in general.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I'm not necessarily sure that this idea that we're having, actually, I mean, if we were real scientists here, we'd go we'd now create another experiment where we were able to incentivize people without putting pressure on them, just to see if it was really the incentives that demotivated people or if it was the pressure that gets attached to a monetary incentive that demotivates people. Patty, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I really appreciate everything that Nikki said. I think she really brought up some very, useful and interesting thoughts about that. I think it reminds me of, conversations you and I have had about reframing things. For example, speaking in front of a large group, which is really scary for me, but something that I have done. And when I've been most successful is when I have detached from the outcome, when I've been able to say, believe in myself and say, I'm here because there's something I need to share and I care deeply, about these people and the growth of them. And by getting the focus off of myself and having to be, the best speaker they ever saw or whatever the hell that is, but mostly, so for me, it's really been about reframing. And I think that's a really important piece to all this is, and I appreciate what Nikki said about, well, sometimes, an incentive makes you do something maybe you wouldn't normally do. And it really does tap into your unmet needs, because if you feel like you need to show others that you're really good at something, then you're going to grab the bait for the incentive. But how many times, I mean, it's like turning down a job that pays a lot of money but isn't what you want to do. I mean, that's for me a great example. The incentive is, and I've done this more than once, and where someone has said, well, I'm going to pay you a lot of money if you do this, and I've said that's not what I want to do, and I felt completely comfortable saying that, even though, I'd I'd like more money, but not at that price. That's too big of a cost. And so for me, I find that when I can tap in to my, who I really am and what I really value and be able to sit with that, then I'm not nearly as likely to grab onto an incentive that really doesn't speak to what matters to me. When I'm feeling not so confident or in a place where I feel like I need to prove myself, then I am so much more susceptible to that. And then I fall prey to that whole thing of the pressure, and then I don't usually perform well. And I usually don't feel very satisfied with the results. So it's a really interesting, thing to think. I never quite thought about it like that, but this has really helped clarify some thoughts that, I've had kind of bumping around in my head for a while. Very, lots more to think about.
Yeah, well, this is so interesting to me, this conversation, because one of the things that I'm making connections in my brain, and one of the things that I'm connecting to this is something that I read about two different ways that the brain thinks or takes in information. And there's one way where you're very narrowly focused on something. And there's another system, I don't remember the names of the system, but there's another system that scans the environment for threats, that sort of scans the environment. So there's a way that your brain will just sort of scan the whole environment and sort of pick up ideas at random, and then there's the place when your brain will really focus. Well, the interesting thing is the context that I was thinking about that in was ADD, because I was talking to someone about it and about how it could relate to anxiety, because when you're anxious, maybe you're just always scanning the environment for stress, so it's for threats, so it's really hard to focus. And it would make sense that maybe that part of the brain is a little bit more developed, the kind that's always scanning. So that's sort of interesting. Or maybe there's the creative brain. But in Dan Pink's example, essentially what they discovered is that the incentives, what those incentives did was cause people to do the blinder focus. So when you're focusing, you are so focused that you're shutting everything else out. And so it's kind of like all your attention is going to maybe one narrow spot instead of kind of scanning around. And then the people who did well on the creative tasks and the out-of-the-box thinking tasks, it's because they were less focused and intent, and they were more relaxed, and so they were just taking in sort of random thoughts, kind of like brainstorming. So this is interesting because now I've just pretty much stated a paradox, which is in one situation I'm saying, well, maybe the reason people with ADD have such a hard time focusing is because they're anxious and they're always scanning their environment for threats instead of focusing. But then I'm saying at the same time, maybe the reason the people could only focus when they were given the incentives is because they were stressed out and they were feeling the pressure to focus, and so that shut down all the parts of the brains that would scan the environment for threats. So, but I think they're different situations, right? So sometimes when you're relaxed, you're able to scan the environment more. Or maybe people who are more creative are the ones who are always scanning the environment more, which is why they sometimes come across as more disorganized. And maybe there's a different type of person who tends to favor that focus part of their brain. So I don't know. But I'm bringing that into it because I'm beginning to see how we talk about motivating people and we talk about what it takes to motivate people. They obviously got some great information from all of these experiments, right? So what they really learned from all of these experiments is that higher level jobs that involve creativity, when we need people to be creative and come up with interesting solutions and be engaged, not just do the work, not just show up and do the work because we're going to get paid to do the work, but actually be engaged, that we need to set up situations that allow people to not think about their needs and to be able to get involved the way they want to contribute to the world and be creative about that.
What you say is, it just makes so much sense, and yet initially when we started this conversation, this idea of rational thinking. I mean, there's a really interesting book out called Thinking Slow and Fast by a famous economist. Forget this. I think it's such a.
I have the book right here. I'm reading it. It's Daniel Kahneman. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very interesting, and really enlightened me about how we make decisions, because I think we make them very rationally when in fact we really don't. Mm-hmm. But this whole idea of kind of how we address something, and I think it really seems to matter, where we stand with ourselves. The more in tune with ourselves we are. I mean, it's like someone who in a disaster can really keep their head. Something terrible is happening and someone has this ability to help others, to calm others down, to, call the right authorities when other people are just running around screaming and stuff. And I've been both of those people in really horrible situations. I've been the one that's been incredibly calm. I've been the one that's been running around like a chicken with my head cut off. And the difference between them is where I was really sitting in terms of my own self. And so this idea of really grounding ourselves and really, coming to terms with who we are and how we, how we show up and how we want to be is a really important component of this, because I think when we're less concerned about how we what we look like and how we're impressing people, that's when we do our best work.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I give my best speeches. That's when I teach my best classes. That's when I create the more beautiful things, is when I'm not so thinking, oh, my God, someone's going to hate this. It's like, no, I love this. It's beautiful. This is what I'm going to do, the hell with everybody else. And that's the right answer. So it's really interesting. Reminds me of all the work I need to do on myself.
all the work we all need to do, but very interesting that you bring up that book by Daniel Kahneman, because that's a book I'm reading right now. I just read The Undoing Project, which is the story of him and his partner. And then I had this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, for the last several years just sitting, and I hadn't ever gotten into it. And so after reading The Undoing Project, I decided I'm going to read this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So in our April Best Practices Forum, we're going to actually dive into that stuff, all those cognitive biases that he discovered in his experiment. So that's what we're going to talk about in April. And in the month between, in March, next month, we're going to be talking about systems and processes. So we've got all sorts of really great stuff coming up. But there's one exercise that I did in our in-person class that I think the two of you can do really fast, and it might be an interesting way to wrap this up. And that is, I had everybody think of a time when they were motivated and a time when they weren't motivated, and see if they could compare the two. And I started that class, so they didn't have any of this information when they did it, but we started with a sort of discussion of what they thought was the root of their own motivation, versus when they weren't. And of course, everybody said the example they gave when they were motivated had something to do with whether they felt something was worthwhile, whether they really enjoyed it or not. But if something was going to drain them, then it turned out that they really weren't motivated. And so we kind of turned that discussion into how do you motivate other people, which turned into a very interesting discussion. But what I would love to do here is just have you think about that question, when was I really motivated and when wasn't I really motivated, and is there anything about that maps to this? And I'd like to just kind of go around and do a final round robin here. And in this final round robin, I'd like to maybe, if you can think of your story really fast, what you're getting out of this session, and maybe provide context for your answer with your example of when you were really motivated and when you weren't really motivated. But so what you're getting out of this. But then the second thing I'd like to hear from you is, what are you going to do with it? Is there a way that you can apply this stuff that we've talked about so far to your life in some way? And so we're going to go in this order. We're going to go Nikki first and then Patty. And but I'll go before Nikki, just so that you can have a couple minutes to think about it. So I gave examples in this earlier discussion of 2 jobs I had. And in both jobs, I had times when I was really motivated and times when I wasn't motivated. And they were extremes. So, and in both cases, they were different jobs at the same company. So I had one job at a company where I felt like we really weren't helping people, and I completely lost motivation. But then when I had that same job where I had a lot of autonomy, I got to create my own work, I got to create things the company valued them, I got to share these useful things that I created with people, and I got to sort of be right in there doing all sorts of things that seemed really fun and valuable. I was very engaged, and I think I did really good work. I was at least very motivated. And the same thing happened in my other job, where I had a job like that to start out with, really enjoyed it for several years, and then I moved into a job that was more structure, and I got bored very quickly and began to feel like what I was doing was not making a contribution. So as soon as I got that piece where I didn't feel like what I was doing was really helping anybody, in my own opinion, then I noticed a difference. So I realized that it obviously had to come from me. The motivation obviously comes from me, and it comes from what in my opinion, I think is worthwhile and not. And I noticed a lot of people in our session felt the same way. In their opinion, whether something was worth something or not made a huge difference to them. So when it comes to motivating other people, sometimes they're in jobs where some of their job is not going to be that fun for them. Some of their job they might really engage with, and some they might. So that ended up translating into a huge discussion about how we help employees get a sense of purpose, even if part of their job isn't something that they naturally engage with. So we have to help create a sense of purpose for them by tying kind of what they're doing to what the good is that they're participating in that's maybe larger than themselves. So that was a very interesting conversation. So, this whole thing is what I'm taking away from me. I'm just going to keep thinking about it and integrating it, and maybe taking some of the things that we talked about today and seeing what new models pop up that I can share with you guys over the next several months. So, Nikki, what about you? How would you like to close off today?
So I started thinking about motivation on a very like everyday level. And then I thought, like most people always say to do the hardest thing first, like when you wake up from the day. And it's probably because pretty much all your needs are met, right? Like you just were rested, you probably just ate, and you have a lot of energy. So you're really full of everything that you can exert. So whenever you have to do something hard, you do it first. And then I started thinking, okay, so later in the day then, what are things that motivate me on a simple level? And I was like, well, people can pretty much get me to go anywhere if they offer me free food. And then I thought, okay, so again, that's meeting my needs. And if it weren't about, so like let's say I wasn't hungry, right? Then the likelihood, the motivation for me to drive across town to have a meeting about some project would be a lot less likely because you can't really motivate me by food. So then what is it that is going to get me to go? And like you were saying, I think, so if it's not meeting a need that I need anymore, then you keep going up that hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy, into meeting another need, which can be, what were you saying? Self-esteem, like your value in the community, and feeling like, because either then at that point, they're motivating you by saying, I'm your friend and I need your help. And you come, and so you're going to create community, and you're going to create your own value in that. And so I really, I see how it really, that is super important. It's like if you want people to work well, you have to make sure that their needs are all met first, and that they're not worried about anything so that they do work well. And if you don't have the resources to offer them, then you have to reframe the way that you're convincing them or motivating them to achieve the goals. So if you can't say, I can offer you $1 million, will you come? You can say, but this is what you're doing for the community, and this is what value and impact you're going to have, and you play to that part of the, of the pyramid, then I think
of their inner hierarchy. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. And Patty, how would you like to close this off today?
Well, it's interesting when I thought about motivation and demotivation. I actually a really great example is a job when I ran the campus in Irvine, and you're very familiar with that since you were around at that time. So I did my best work when I focused on the students. When I, said we're here to serve students, and we were all, my staff and I and the faculty were all on the same page, and we were just doing really creative stuff. We were community oriented. We were doing things to help the community. Where I became very demotivated with that job is when it changed and started to ask me to follow numbers. How many students enrolled? Why didn't this person enroll? And they started, instead of having me be voice of the campus, they had me sitting there reading reports. And so for many months, when things started to shift, I was going through this very difficult dichotomy of, one day I would be incredibly motivated and like I was really hitting all the marks and stuff. And then the next day I would just feel like I was a failure. And it was just such an interesting emotional ride. But now I can see quite, much clearer what was really happening was the incentives and the numbers thing. It was all set up to be incredibly competitive. And I, really, and I even said something to my boss, and I said, publishing these reports, I'm wondering how much they really serve to, motivate us when, maybe there's other ways to do that. Oh, no, you're wrong. You're okay. Well, maybe I was wrong, but now I realize I was right, that there's other ways to get people to feel good. I ended up leaving the job because the negative took over took over the positive. But just really interesting within the same environment how it shifted on almost a daily basis.
And isn't it interesting how you can be in the same job and maybe not in the exact same role, but your job duties shift a little bit, and what used to be really motivating becomes really draining.
Absolutely, and that was just what popped in my head. But I think in terms of what I got out of this is that to really think about this and really think back and about times when I felt incredibly motivated and creative, and times when I really felt pressed to do things. And what I'm going to do with it is I think I'm going to read the book. I think I can do that. Which is, and then I want to kind of see how this all plays out with, getting my company started. And I think there's some pieces in there that are really important that I could put to use. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for being on the call today. I think it was a great discussion. I appreciate your participation, and have a great rest of your week.
Okay, nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.